So Dr. Bunny Pozell is, one of the first folks that I met when I came to UNMC. I actually met her in Florida. Was it Florida, the American Heart Association meeting?
Oh, we were at the DNI conference, I believe.
Oh, that's what it was.
Yeah.
No, it was actually AHA, and
it was. Yes, you're right.
Everyone else. It was a DNI panel that I was on. I think that
that's what it was. That's exactly what it was.
Yes, and so very enthusiastic, and she is an outstanding scholar, and I'll give the formal introduction that she's the professor and Dorothy Hodges Olson Endowed Chair in the College of Nursing here at University of Nebraska Medical Center. She has courtesy faculty appointments in the Department of Cellular and Integrative Physiology and the Department of Cardiology at UNMC. And with that, you might not be surprised to know that she's a nurse scientist who specializes in the care and management of patients with heart failure. And we'll hear a little bit about some of her proposals and projects in that area in her talk today. She continues as a nurse practitioner to see patients at Nebraska Medicine in heart failure and transplant. And she has been, which is really great for us, principal investigator or collaborating investigator on a lot of internal and external grants, but in particular, she has been successful in securing grants from the National Institutes of Health. And her RO1, which was called Heart Camp, was designed to test a multi-component intervention to improve adherence to exercise in patients with heart failure. She has a ton of mentoring experience, nearly 60 graduate students, which I can barely fathom that, as well as junior faculty, and I'm sure many of her own colleagues also see her as a mentor. So with that, probably not sufficient introduction. I'll kick it over to you, Dr. Pozell.
More than sufficient. And I will say too, we have plenty of time with this. My presentation is not nearly the length, so don't hesitate to stop me. We can discuss. Paul and Kiana, definitely, you've got a lot of expertise with integration of theory and conceptual models in your research as well. So certainly interject as we go here. So first, I'd like to just kind of give you a frame, and you're going to go on a journey with me, because in the beginning of my research career, I don't know that I thoroughly appreciated how important a theory and a conceptual framework could be in terms of guiding you with developing that whole grant and so forth. So that's what this talk is supposed to be about. How do you integrate a conceptual model into your research, and to emphasize how that's done in a grant proposal? So I would say the very most important thing is, identify the problem. And I will say that I have always been very thankful for the practice that I have had as a nurse practitioner in caring for heart failure patients. That it gives you a true understanding of what the real clinical issues are for those patients and what they struggle with. What do they need from a research perspective? And to me, that's just invaluable. And if you're not a clinician giving direct care, obviously, the more connected you can be with individuals who are. So I would say that's an important to think about for your research team, having someone who is very connected to your population of interest. So as a nurse practitioner, oh, go ahead.
I think that might have been echo, but I'm going to ask a question at this opportunity anyway, since you paused there. We did have a talk that maybe 2 sessions ago that focused on how you generate your research question, your research ideas collaboratively with community partners and stakeholders. And it really struck me as you talked through here about, the role of being a practitioner and having interactions with patients, that gives you unique insights. And so my question would be, because I think we have some folks in here that also have that type of background, how do you make sure that your views of the patient experience are generalizable and representative of a broader group of patients? And this is just more from, your experience.
So, one of the things that I was doing early on was the things they were telling me, I was going to the literature and seeing if things were kind of validated there. I also went back to the patients themselves and said, here's what I'm observing, here's what I'm hearing. I did hear my second bullet, heart failure patients were very sedentary and afraid to be more active. So as I would care for these patients, they would tell me, well, they looked at me cross-eyed, frankly, when I would, they've been told they have heart failure. And as you can well imagine, for a lay individual to be told that, or any individual to be told that, the last thing you think you probably are safe to do is to go out and stress your heart. So, right. So it kind of fit together, Paul, in terms of what they were telling me, what I, kind of was aware of. But I early on, did a study using accelerometry and realized just how very, very sedentary. I mean, I would get some of those accelerometers back and you could tell that maybe they had been up to the bathroom, and that was the extent of the activity. So I had some objective kind of information, plus we have the beauty of some of the internal cardiac monitors have accelerometers with the devices. And so we actually get a report when we do the monitor check, we get a report of how active they've been. So I had a lot of validation from those kinds of things too, to say, yes, they're sedentary. This is a problem. Yeah, but going back to them and validating that then, and asking them frankly, what keeps you from being more active? And that's why the connection to the patient was so helpful, because I could say, here's what I'm seeing. Is that true for you? And if so, why is that? Why are you not, able to be more active?
Yeah, that's so great. And, for those that were here for that other discussion, this really does align when we talk about the collaborative or involvement levels of community engagement. And so it doesn't always mean that you have to have a community advisory board. And we talked a little bit about that, but as a practicing clinician and provider, you oftentimes have at your fingertips your intended audience. And by doing exactly as Bunny did, hey, this is what I think. I'm going to fact check it first with these folks. Then I'm going to go and figure out what's going on in the literature, and I'm going to come back and fact check it again to make sure that it's generalizable to my population. And then I'm going to start asking why questions, which is when we finally get to the science. Right now we're, before that, you're kind of characterizing the situation. And then when you start getting to the why questions, then you can start to think about more translational research that starts to focus on developing intervention and strategies to be able to help and improve the health of that particular constituent. So thank you, Bunny, for for helping us to underscore some of our points from before.
Well, so there's this goes on in terms of knowing more than just what the patient is saying and what the literature says. So review the literature and then know current practice. So what are the guidelines? What are these patients being told from a provider perspective? And you know, what's the milieu, what's the current state of the situation? And so one of my very first studies was an American Heart Association study, and so just kind of the state of the science and what was going on in terms of practice at that point in time. There was no reimbursement for patients to attend cardiac rehab for heart failure. Certainly if they'd had an MI or a CABG or a stent, a PCI, they would have qualified for rehab, but there was no reimbursement for rehabilitation. So there was no, you know, rehab is kind of where patients learn how to exercise. They kind of feel safe because they know they're being monitored as they're doing this. And so that was like a big aha when I realized that was the case of, you know, and patients, if they were going to go to cardiac rehab, which is where they probably would feel the safest, it was going to be an out-of-pocket expense. And frankly, for these patients, they struggle to pay for their medications, let alone everything else that's required. So it just wasn't going to be anything feasible for them. And so I started to ask, well, why isn't there reimbursement? You know, I was pretty naive at that point. I was the beginning, you know, why hasn't this happened? This is so obvious. But you know, people quickly said, well, there's not enough research that says this is a benefit to those patients. And so until that happens and until it can be shown to be something safe, you know, it's not going to be a reimbursed kind of service. So, okay, well, that was certainly something I cared about and wanted to try to make a difference in that. So as you went to the literature, then what you were seeing was very small, kind of pilot size, small samples of studies looking at what are the effects of exercise in heart failure patients. Oh my, they must be needing something for my mom. My phone is just blowing up. But anyway, these small studies weren't sufficient evidence to really say, yes, Medicare would reimburse or other insurance programs and so forth. The other thing that was important to recognize was exercise, and this isn't a surprise either. A guideline is built on the evidence, the research evidence, whether it is high enough level research to then recommend this in a guideline of care. So it wasn't in the guidelines of care for these patients to be exercising. And the other kind of thing that was happening around this same time was the major trials with use of beta blockers in heart failure. When I first started nursing, it would have been something you would not have done, would be to give patients a beta blocker. And so many of the small studies that I was reviewing in the literature, these patients weren't on the beta blockers or other guideline directed medications. So the question that raised in my mind was, well, we know that those medications obviously tend to improve functional capacity in these patients and so forth. So, you know, how do you know what the exercise would contribute above and beyond just good pharmacology and pharmacologic care? So knowing that I was at this time I lived in Lincoln and worked with Brian Hart, and we were one of the largest enrollers in the carvedilol trial. So I knew our patients were on the medications that of the current day, and we obviously have more now, but at that point in time. And so I thought, well, that would contribute to the science if I were to do this in patients that were on guideline-directed therapies with the medications. So that was kind of the state of the science. Now let's think about, well, okay, I'm this naive researcher, and you know, what I frankly, you know, in terms of conceptual model or theory to guide this, I mean, I didn't really have it in this the early studies that I did.
Bunny, I have a question. This is Abby. It just popped into my head.
Sure.
When you were looking into the literature at the time, and that just seems 99 doesn't seem so long ago, but I guess it was
It
like
was.
a week ago in terms of our understanding of how exercise is like medicine. So were you looking into nursing literature, research literature, or were you going all into the whole, like, exercise science, nutrition, the whole gamut of what's possible?
Whole gamut. You would never, you know, that would have been kind of a fatal flaw to just focus on the nursing studies, because obviously those studies weren't coming out of that science at all. They were more you know, exercise physiology and sometimes medicine, but pretty critical to thoroughly from all disciplinary perspectives. And yeah, good question, Abby. You know, that is a pretty important piece of this too, to kind of know what is the state of the science as a whole. What's everybody done?
The reason I say it too is we tend to stay siloed in our disciplines, and it's you know, some disciplines maybe more than others, and I feel like yeah it's just so important to take all the literature into consideration when you're looking for gaps.
Yep. You know, I've been very blessed and fortunate along the way in terms of my team members, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But early on, I knew, you know, I didn't really have I'd taken exercise physiology, but that wasn't my training. And so I wanted someone who had a good background with that. So I reached out to the College of Allied Health and Physical Therapy, and Joe Norman was very interested. He actually had directed a cardiac rehab program. So he brought a lot of expertise in terms of working with these types of patients. And, you know, that was very helpful too, in terms of, you know, him being able to tell me much more about working with these patients to get them to exercise. So that the American Heart Association grant, it was purely just to look at effects of exercise training. And I wanted to do this similar to a cardiac rehab model, using 12 weeks of exercise and looking at all the impact on these patients. The studies to date had primarily focused on the physiological and, you know, the aerobic capacity and so forth, but I wanted to see how it affected psychological quality of life outcomes as well. So that was another unique contribution I was able to bring. It was a very small study, but we did have 3 groups, and this is where the another team member that I was so very fortunate to have, Kathy Duncan, who was another nursing professor, but she's since retired. But early on, we had kind of collaborated on some research, and so she wanted to continue that collaboration. And it was her comment that, well, Bunny, exercise is fine, but you got to get people to do it and adhere to it. And so from the very beginning of these studies, when I was more focused on these physiological, psychological, and quality of life outcomes, she was saying, we got to think about how we're going to get them to adhere to this. And she had studied a lot of this. She had a PhD in business administration and had really focused on, you know, goals and how to motivate people and so forth. So she really understood that science and brought that to the team. So I had Joe, who kind of knew the exercise physiology science. I had Kathy, who kind of knew this whole motivational, you know, helping people try to adhere. And at that point, the primary thing she was focused on and emphasized was goal setting and giving patients feedback, and was interested in, you know, if you vary how you give patients feedback, does that make a difference? But we set up this design so that we could look at the effects of the adherence. And she served kind of in a coaching role and would meet with patients, and they would set a goal for the week, and then they would review that in terms of, did they meet the goal, give them feedback, talk about barriers. You know, she was kind of the interventionist in terms of coaching the patients. And so that group got that as part of the intervention. But again, this was sort of, I mean, there wasn't any theory per se guiding this, which I'll talk kind of more about. But that study, obviously, it made a difference. At that point in time, we used the SF-36, and we saw role physical, role emotional, and mental functioning subscales that were significantly higher adjusted means. And as I had said earlier, I implemented this within a cardiac rehab setting. And interestingly, in debriefing with patients, and here's what is so critical and kind of ties in with what you were asking earlier, Paul. You know, I wanted to know what the patients thought of the intervention and how they perceived it. Was it helpful? Was it not? And they all pretty much all came back and said, you know, I don't feel like the rehab staff understands heart failure. I don't think they know that I'm not like that patient who had a stent or had a cabbage, or, you know, I get really tired and I get really short of breath, and they just don't seem to understand that. And so it made me start to think about, okay, this tells me quite a bit. I need to understand from the cardiac rehab staff perspective. So I reached out to those community partners, if you will, and said, you know, talk to me about this. How much training do you get for dealing with patients with heart failure? Well, guess how much training they got? 0. Yeah, they didn't get any training for, so, you know, how are they going to know the ins and outs of helping people to exercise when they have heart failure, or even understand the patient's fears and concerns and so forth? So that kind of got me thinking more about the kind of next study sort of thing. Let me stop there. Anybody have comments, questions, whatever?
Yes, I would like to ask, is there a particular intensity of exercise that you recommend for your cardiac rehab in this? Was it just a treadmill walking, or was it just a walking 30 minutes for 3 times a week like we tell the PAD patients? So just kind of curious about your cardiac rehab.
Very good question, because, you know, at that time there really wasn't, like I had said earlier, it wasn't in the guidelines.
Yeah, no recommendations.
There weren't any recommendations at that point in time.
Sure.
So we had to err on the side of being safe with this. So we always did the cardiopulmonary stress test to kind of obtain what their maximum capacity was. And then we started them at 40% of their heart rate reserve. So we started them at a very low level and then would work them up. But that was also something that I don't think the rehab staff truly understood, because you don't really start at a 40% heart rate reserve with somebody who's had, you know, a PCI or a cabbage or something like that. So we had specific guidelines based on keeping the patient safe at that point in time, because that was pretty important and big deal, especially for the IRB at that point in time too. Yeah.
So was the exercise supervised, you would say?
Yeah. Oh yes, it was it was in the rehab center along with all the others. So very definitely they got the 36 sessions that was typical of rehab in those days. It's not now, but
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I was just curious to see how much progress has been done from then to now.
Yeah, there is progress, definitely.
Definitely,
Yeah, but still a lot that we can do. Yeah. So interestingly, so I had sent the same grant into American Heart and to an internal funding opportunity at that time, the UNMC Outcomes Grant. And the timing was almost identical. And I found out within a week of each other that both of them wanted to fund the study. Nice problem to have, huh? So what I had proposed was this 12-week exercise program. I really was interested in following people. You know, it's always kind of important to think about follow-up and whether a behavior is sustained. And so since UNMC Outcomes Grant was an internal source, I presented the issue to them, said, hey, American Heart wants to fund the 12 weeks that I originally proposed. I really would like a follow-up period at 24 weeks and, you know, to see how these patients are doing. Are you willing to accept me extending and doing that with this funding? And they agreed. So it pays to be creative and think a little bit outside the box with things like that. So it really was, we were able then to see my colleague, Kathy, who was serving in this exercise coaching role with the goal setting and feedback and so forth, continue to work with this group then from weeks 12 to 24. The exercise only were just like every other cardiac rehab patient. They were just kind of done, and we know what happens then. They don't continue to exercise typically. So in essence, we were testing if somebody interacts with these people on a weekly basis, can we keep them adhering to the exercise? And so we followed them like I have here on the slide, and she worked with the behavioral adherence strategies, and they adhered to 5 sessions of exercise per week at 104% for the whole 3 months. So that group did very, very well with staying adherent to the exercise. So in essence, it was kind of a proof of concept for this role of this coach who would give work with them on goal setting and give them feedback and support them basically in the adherence. So those were kind of the first 2 studies, and then it was time to really start to think about this was really weighing on me heavily, that I didn't really have this grounded in any theory or conceptual framework. And so I kind of started to really look into this more and try to think about what fits, what do I need to be working on these patients with. And as I kind of framed for you, they were fearful of doing this. So they kind of needed to know how. They needed to obviously have support of individuals who understood heart failure. That was clear. That was one of the things they had said they didn't really have so much from the cardiac rehab staff. And they really weren't confident that they could do this on their own. So, but before we go into kind of looking at the models and how the decision making I was doing at that point, you know, a theory, the rules and principles that kind of serve as the basis of the research, and their broad concepts then related to your study. Where sometimes a conceptual model is just a specific approach that you take from the theory, and you show the variables and the relationship between those variables in your conceptual model, but it pulls from the theory typically. So as I was,
maybe I can just jump in there. So
yeah,
you know, I think that for folks that do community engaged research, as well as sometimes folks that are doing clinical research and quality improvement type of work, you know, sometimes I don't see the value of having a conceptual model or a theory. And, you know, I think the way that we've managed to make it a little bit more compelling when we bring it into the community engagement or practice-based research network world is that, you know, these theories are actually what distinguishes what we're doing from kind of simple program evaluation and simple outcomes work, where we're trying to say, do X, and then we get change in Y. And what the theoretical or conceptual framework does is it provides us with the reason why what's happening is happening. And by understanding the reason, then we can, you know, if it doesn't work, we can look at it. Was it because our intervention didn't change the thing that we thought it would change, the why? And that it's really, we need to go and look at our intervention? Or is it, you know, that the outcome's not responsive, and then we need to think about our mechanism or our why a little bit more? And then we can also generalize better. So other communities or other clinics could try it the same way and really try and maybe have an intermediate outcome that they could look at to say whether what they're doing is actually going to work out over time.
Yeah, Paul, you're setting the stage perfectly for how the research evolved to that very thing of, well, how we see an effect here, but why do we see that effect? What's the underlying mechanism for that change in their behavior? So oftentimes that's really what is important when you're talking about behavior change research, especially. You need to understand what's responsible for that change, because frequently we put together what I would call multi-component approaches. So it's not just one thing we're doing, we're putting together lots of things. And so then at the end of the day, how do you know what works and what somebody else would then take and replicate, like Paul said, in their clinic? So that really is an important piece of why this is so important and helps advance the science.
I do want to put a plug in for theory-based work in evaluation too, because I just find that so many community-based programs, they don't use theory to build their programs, and then you can't evaluate it because you don't know what outcomes they're looking toward. And so you can also call the theoretical framework a theory of change. And that is grounded in the situation in which you're trying to study or work in.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Thanks, Abby. Yeah. Other comments, questions? So I started to really try to understand all these different theories. And frankly, I could have probably derived important things from others, but I chose social cognitive. And again, that was kind of driven by my awareness that patients, the primary thing was they needed a skill set. They were afraid. They weren't confident at all that they could do this. So the foundational piece of social cognitive theory is that self-efficacy. So it seemed like that was really what I was going for in terms of working with these patients. I wanted to build their confidence in their ability to do this. I wanted them to know how to do it and do it safely. So, and as I said, others could have fit, but it seemed to fit the best for me. So Paul, I know you've used others. Do you want to talk about any of these others?
I think that you've labeled and I think kind of pulled out the primary models. Trans-theoretical model, the Prochaska and DiClemente, really it kind of had its big heyday kind of right around when you were starting this work, and it includes both process as well as predictor types of variables, and so that had a good bit. But really the piece that kind of grew out of that one was just the stage of change, people using that, and much of the rest of it was kind of basic behavioral or social cognitive theory components too. Kiana and I have used the theory of planned behavior in one of the recent COVID hesitancy studies that she's leading, and it focuses on attitudes and normative beliefs, which we think with COVID you could think about that being more important towards people's intention to follow through on a health action. And it's what other people important to me think is probably what's going to drive me, maybe even more than my own attitude, and maybe even more than my control beliefs or kind of the self-efficacy types of beliefs. So I think what I would plug here is that working with your community to identify the appropriate theoretical approach is a good thing to do. I would also say be careful, because you can bore them to tears, and if they don't see what the value is, in it, that, hey, we're really going to try and understand why, or you go too deep into it, you have the chance of kind of turning them off a little bit, or at least glazing their eyes over, which I have done. I am well skilled at doing that, but I'd be careful there. The other thing I'd say is, we've also talked about dissemination implementation science models and theories, and one of the things that I think, as we look here, social ecological models tend to have also a basis. Social cognitive theory talks about the triadic reciprocation between the environment, the person, and the behavior. And, and we know that those three things are interrelated and are causally linked. So, I think that when you think about dissemination implementation science, it's okay to use some of these theories of behavior change, but know that you can't just try and take those up a level and say, hey, I'm now going to use theory of planned behavior at the provider level, and that's what I'm going to do, because we know that the context is so important, and it is for individuals as well. But if you're trying to change individual community member or patient behavior, these theories are outstanding and are good ways to build intervention. If you're looking to make systems changes, they typically need to be embedded within a more comprehensive ecological approach that takes into account context.
That's a really important clarification. What I had listed here was what I kind of had at the time to choose from. This was my point in time. But yes, Paul, I see a lot of socioeconomic, so the biopsychoecological, what is it called?
Like a social ecological framework.
Yeah. So you're considering all those aspects, but this was just purely to change behavior and what was kind of out there at the point in time when I was deciding what to do here. So given that we had some positive effects and good preliminary data, we proposed an R15, and at that time the college qualified. You can't have too much NIH funding or you don't qualify for that. But at the time we did. And so I submitted an R15, and I started to package this whole kind of intervention and called it Heart Camp. And at the time, again, the guidelines still didn't say anything about that these patients should exercise. So ethically, I was okay to just have a group who wasn't exercising that I could compare to. But as we all know, when you give people attention, they often do better. So we designed it so that we had an attention control group that we met with, similar to how we were meeting with the patients who were exercising. And we were looking at estimated energy expenditure. You can see now here, I was actually even looking and going to measure self-efficacy for exercise to see if we did have an effect on that, and adherence to exercise. And then we assessed the other things that we frequently had done in our studies. And so when I was putting together this grant, I, again, really wanted to thread through the grant the theory that I was using. So Bandura's social cognitive has 4 sources of self-efficacy, and they're inactive mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, verbal persuasions, and physiological and affective states. I'll show you how I operationalized that and wove that into the intervention and presented it in the grant. The other thing that we were coming from was the importance of the whole self-regulation, the goal setting, the feedback. And for these patients early on, I mean, I knew again as a provider that there were going to be relapses. Unlike other patients, or well, not so unlike, in all honesty, when it comes to exercise, I think everybody has a relapse now and then, and you have to get back on board. But for these patients, relapse is harder because they are deconditioned, and as they get more conditioned, they aren't as bothered by the shortness of breath and the fatigue. So then when they have a relapse, they have to start slow and build up again. And so relapse is different for them than it is for other people. And that's part of that, going back to understanding this patient population and why they, I think, kind of felt like people weren't understanding them per se. So here was actually a table that I created to put in the grant. And the reviewers loved this. Oh my goodness. They thought this was fantastic because I was being very obvious about how I was using this theory. So, you know, we listed out the things that we thought would be the inactive mastery experiences when these people could return demonstrate use of exercise equipment. They could return demonstrate to us how they were going to self-monitor their heart rate, their symptoms, their daily weights, which is an important thing to monitor in a heart failure patient who's going to exercise. And you know, establishing the goals, and then if they accomplish those goals, that's performance accomplishment. So you can begin to see we tried to think creatively about the things that we could do that would help them with all of this. You'll notice under verbal persuasions, presentation of exercise benefits by the cardiologist. Very few cardiologists were saying a word about being more active. Mm-hmm. And that's a powerful, very powerful thing. So we did also want to try to use web-based. We wanted to have the goals available on the web. We wanted to provide feedback in a graphic form on the web. We wanted to have a chat room and a discussion board for patients. Interestingly, though, so this was kind of before the time of really any of these patients really using, I mean, cell phones were the big bag phone thing. And, you know, they weren't a little helpful handheld tool to monitor yourself or whatever. So basically, that part of this operationalizing it that way wasn't helpful, but we were meeting in person with them. And so that's what we continued to do in terms of giving them feedback. And so one of the key findings was that we did have an effect on the cardiac exercise self-efficacy. Interestingly, the attention control saw an 8% increase, but not nearly as significant as an improvement. We saw an improvement in dyspnea fatigue and actually a worsening of dyspnea fatigue in the attention control. And this was, you know, reinforces the attention control aspect. Quality of life increased significantly in both groups. We didn't talk to the attention control group at all about exercise, but we did discuss heart failure. And in debriefing from this study, patients in that attention control group said, why don't we have more support groups? This has just been wonderful. So obviously social support was a really important thing for these patients. So this contextual information is after this study finished. When this study was ongoing, there weren't any guideline recommendations. In fact, in the grant, I had proposed 5 days a week of exercise, 3 of aerobic and 2 of resistance. And the reviewers were just quite concerned that I was going to have these patients exercising 5 days a week. It was kind of interesting. But that grant was actually funded on the first submission, and I think in part because it did have the strong theoretical background. When this finished, though, the new guidelines were recommending 5 days a week, and that being 30 minutes per day of moderate intensity exercise. So clearly enough research had been done that the guidelines for care were demonstrating it. There still was not a change yet in reimbursement for cardiac rehab. But while I was finishing this, the heart failure action trial was completed. That was a large multi-center trial of individuals with systolic heart failure, reduced ejection fraction heart failure. And it was considered a negative trial. The adjusted analyses demonstrated improvement in mortality. They had mortality and hospitalizations as their primary endpoints. And I always say, I think it was 11% improvement in mortality. And, you know, it was non-significant, but I always think to myself, well, that's pretty significant when it comes to mortality in my mind.
Especially if you're one of the 11%.
Exactly. So, you know, what's clinically significant versus what's statistically significant really is important to think about. But I had people at this point say, well, what are you going to do now? HF Action, the big multi-center trial's been done. Where's your research going to go? Well, again, reviewing the findings from HF Action, I think that might be, yeah. So the NIH multi-center trial had been completed, showed one of their primary things they emphasized from it was that exercise was safe in this population. The adverse event rate in the exercise group was no different than for the people not exercising. So basically that really helped us in terms of saying that it was safe for these people to be exercising. But in the trial itself, there were only 35% of the subjects who were adherent, and they looked at analyses and said there was a true dose response. So I said, okay, we have data to support that we're able to help these patients have better self-efficacy and better adherence. We're going to go forward with that as our primary outcome and propose an R01. And this fared very well too. It was 5th percentile, so it was funded on the first submission. Wow. Yeah, it doesn't happen anymore, I don't think. Rarely. But so this kind of shows just the study model per se. Here, I'll go on to show you. So Heart Camp involves an exercise coach who works with the whole adherence strategy piece. And again, we kept the same self-efficacy beliefs as a part of this. I felt like I needed to actually identify more than just self-regulation, a theory. So Miller and Brickman was a model of future-oriented motivation and self-regulation, which was something that was in NIH had put together an adherence consortium, and they talked about this. So I thought, okay, that's a good way to go. So I kind of blended the two models. And here now, one of the things that we wanted to show you is how the underlying theoretical gets weaved through. So the aims for that R01, you can see the primary aim was adherence to exercise. But notice here, and this goes back to what Paul was saying, aim 2, evaluate which components of the Heart Camp intervention mediate the effects of the intervention on adherence. So mediation actually tests whether the underlying mechanism is responsible for what you're seeing in terms of the change of outcome. So we designed the study up front to look at each of these components, knowledge, attitudes, self-efficacy for exercise, and use of self-management skills. We also put in social support. And so we had 5 components in this intervention that we laid out. Let me show you next. We also looked at all the heart camp on specific health outcomes, but we also tested moderation to make sure that race, gender, age, those things weren't moderating the effect. And then we did a qualitative aim. I've always strongly believed it's important to understand from the individual participant perspective what's going on, their perception of what's happening with the intervention and so forth. So this time in the grant proposal, this was the table that laid out the intervention and these intervention components. So knowledge, these were the intervention strategies and activities that we felt were important to knowledge. And how were we doing that? We were primarily, again, this coach you'll see comes in big time. We did attitudes. So one of the things, safety, again, that was part of this underlying attitude about exercise. Is it safe to do? Benefits and barriers to exercise. We worked with those, and the coach was made aware of each individual's perceived barriers so they could work with them. Again, the same self-efficacy kind of things we had done previously. And then we kind of explicated these whole behavioral self-management skills. And you can see that we actually focused on relapse management. So I'll talk more about how we operationalize kind of educating them and working with them. Social support, we had 6 weekly sessions where we were going to give them knowledge and allow them to become a group to interact. But because we needed so many subjects in the R01, we couldn't design this so that we had cohorts of individuals like we had in the R15, which then really impacts your social support. It was a rolling admission, so they didn't have the same people in their group. Well, that doesn't work when it comes to social support. And you'll see that didn't turn out to be an active mechanism. I'll talk more about that. So
can I ask, this is Kate, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About that? Because it relates to social support, but also the coach. Was the coach a nurse, and how was he or she prepared? How did you standardize the coaching? And did the coach provide any social support?
Oh, yes. The coach, I think, did provide social support. Good question, Kate. So we operationalized this study. We did within the context. Let me go back. Notice here I have a run-in phase where they got 9 exercise training sessions. Those 9 sessions were done in cardiac rehab and being monitored and having, kind of learning the machines and all of that. And they had to complete those before they would get randomized. And once they were randomized, then each facility this was done in a hospital-based facility. So in Lincoln, it was with Brian, and the second site was in Detroit, and it was with Henry Ford, that facility. And so we hired actual facility staff to coach them. So as you set up a mediation aim, you have to have obviously measures of each of these components in order to test that in a mediation analysis. So there wasn't a real good knowledge questionnaire, and but I did find NHLBI had developed this one about how physical activity affects the heart, and so wasn't a lot of evidence about reliability and validity. And at the end of the day, this test of knowledge, do I still think knowledge is an important component and probably an active mechanism of this intervention? I do, but we didn't have an adequate measure to show that it was an active mechanism. Attitudes toward exercise, I had a scale that does have good reliability and validity. It has both negative and positive attitudes. Self-efficacy, we used a barrier, self-efficacy or confidence in exercise behavior. We used the physical activity self-regulation scale, excellent scale for this study. And you'll see that it did show as an active mechanism. Social support, again, that did not come out as a mediator. However, I think it relates to the measure that we use, the Robinson support scale. And Kate, to your point about, didn't they probably get some social support from the coach? Yes, we thought they probably did, but Robinson support scale was not sensitive to that or specific to pick that up. So again, the choice of measures here can impact whether it ultimately tests out as a significant mediator. So just this, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we did see the intervention have a significant effect on adherence. So this C pathway, that was a significant effect. But then what we wanted to know is, did we accomplish that effect through these components? Were they the active mechanism? So you have to test whether the intervention affects these things. And then if you put these in the model, the mediation model, does this intervention to adherence effect go away? In other words, is it because of this? And we did have, well, first, this is the adherence. The blue line is our heart camp group. We kind of backed out of the picture at 12 months, but really for this population to be exercising for 12 months, that was pretty good. But interestingly, I didn't really go into this, but usual care, what we gave with them was the same 9 training episodes in cardiac rehab. We gave them paid access to the exercise facility. So we basically removed the barriers to exercise because we wanted to see, you know, does our intervention compared to them trying to do this on their own, removing the barrier of having a place to do it and knowing how to do it. So that's how we tested this, and it did make a difference. But then here were the significant things that mediated. Self-efficacy was definitely a significant mediator in this. Negative attitudes. So as we improved or lessened their negative attitudes about exercise, it was an active component of the intervention. And relapse management, actually, that was a subscale on the self-regulation scale that we used. And lo and behold, and it's not surprising because of the patient population. So we did see significant mediation. So we know these are active components in this intervention and this behavior change. So I just emphasize this: successful grants require a really strong team. You want your expertise coming from multiple directions, and there's no one person who's able to know and understand all the things you need to understand, and then it takes a ton of review and revision. So that's all I had together for formal presentation, but Paul, I'm sure you could add additional information, and we can certainly discuss whatever you guys might want to discuss.
Yeah, I think, we have most folks here were use your little reaction and just raise your hand if you were around when we talked about causal maps. Okay. Not as many as I thought, but that's okay. We'll go over it anyway and turn off your hand up. Otherwise, I'm going to think everyone was asking questions. Heidi Keeler. So, with the things that Bunny has just talked through really align well with that idea of understanding, and that's how we talked about with communities. Hey, let's make a map of here's the outcome you want. Here's the things that you want to do. Well, before we think about that, what are the things that are leading to the outcome that you want? What are the things that are leading to the outcome that you don't want? And then start to, as we'll do a little bit later on, map your intervention strategies to those causal factors. So I think this was a really nice description of that. And, the other thing that this is a community engaged clinical and translational research institute. And, I think, Bunny, you have done a really nice job with, first of all, showing us how you integrate a theoretical approach into a proposal and how that evolves over time. And I think that's one of the other things that is really key to this type of work, is that science will make your work evolve, and your patient population or your community partners will also make your work evolve, as will the context within which you want those to be delivered. Those contexts also result in evolution of the work that you do. And I thought it was so good to see that that just laid out so well in your work with heart failure, Bunny. And the last kind of editorial comment I'll make, and then we'll just kind of open it up for questions and see if others have questions on it, is just kind of you sold it, but you kind of undersold the degree to which your work was generated through interactions with the audience that you were hoping would benefit from your work. And, and you did it in a way that's different than I do it. You did it in a way that's different than Kiana does it, because you are a clinical professional, right? Mm-hmm. And so for people that are in that field, in some ways, they almost have a head up or a foot up in terms of doing this type of work, because you get to see what's going on firsthand. And, and we always talk about getting out of the office, and because what we do, if we sit in our office as academics, we get really good with the literature, but we get kind of out of touch with what's going on in the real world. So getting into your office is incredibly important for community engaged research. And as a clinician, you almost get to stay in your office and get the same type of information that we get. So it's just really helpful. And I hope that people that are here, that I know we have a lot of folks from a nursing backgrounds, and I think we have some others from allied health professions. And I know we on occasion get our physicians in here too, but this is just a great starting point for someone that's wanting to do this type of work. Okay, I will open the floor.
One of the things I didn't say is kind of next study, and I did submit a subsequent R01 and did the resubmission. It was scored both times, but not at the funding line. So we were in that grant proposing to do a virtual comparison to our regular heart camp. So if we coach people virtually, can we see the same result as an in-person kind of coach? So, and that was not successful. So one of my postdocs who came here and actually stayed, Wendy Alonso, did do a sub-analysis from our R1 data with HFpEF, the preserved ejection fraction patients, and reduced ejection fraction is now reimbursed by Medicare because of all the large clinical trial and the showing that it's safe and so forth. But HFpEF patients still don't have cardiac rehab. And interestingly enough, pharmacologic things haven't been all that beneficial. You know, of course, they've tried all the drugs that we use in reduced ejection fraction, but they're not effective in preserved ejection fraction. And exercise is the one intervention that really significantly improves things for these patients. So we've got more targeted now. Wendy submitted an R01. We analyzed the subgroup of HFpEF because we included both in the R01. And those patients were actually more adherent than our reduced ejection fraction. So you wonder, is it because they are benefiting so much from it? You got them kind of conditioned and seeing improvement, and they stuck to it. So and her R01 is scored, won't be funded on the first round, but we'll be resubmitting it. We just got the summary statements. And interestingly, one of the things, Paul, I need to talk to you about this, how you respond to this. One of the criticisms was we didn't have a behavioral psychologist on the team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always a.
Yeah. And, you know, they acknowledge that, yes, we've done a significant body of work related to this, and it is theory-based. But I think that just illustrates that, you know, they want to see that you've got the right expertise on the team. Even if you've kind of developed that expertise over the course of your career, they want to see the professional person that's trained that way. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, you know, our usual response to that when we have people that have the skill set to do the work is to add a consultant that has that background, you know, for minimal time to help you go through it. But yeah, I feel your pain. I know that I've gotten comments before that, you know, we need somebody with, I do a lot of obesity research, and they'll say, well, you need somebody that has a nutrition background to do your obesity interventions. And, you know, like, well, you know, it's like we've done these a lot. And so then we reach out to my PhD RD friend and hey, you want a consulting gig, and away you go.
Yeah, I think that is how we will respond. So I'll probably pick your brain on that.
Funny, I'm going to jump in. Thank you. I've heard you talk about your work before, and I'm always so impressed. But as somebody who's, you know, what I really like this time, because of where I am right now, is the fact that you were successful. And I'm sorry, my phone just decided to ring. To go back and forth between, you know, your clinical experience and your. Darn, what? I'm so sorry. That just makes me crazy.
Sounds like an angel getting its wings.
Yeah, I guess so. But anyhow, you were able to go, okay, here's what I'm seeing in clinical. What does the literature say? Let me validate with patients and back and forth. And I find that I'm really guilty of being so embedded in what I think I'm seeing. And, you know, I go and, you know, you have to go find the literature that validates what you know, and I just appreciate the discipline that you've got, that you've applied to that, because I do tend to just say, well, I know what needs to be done.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. It's very integrated. You know, my practice and my research have been, and I over the years have been told I should not be practicing. I did cut it down so that I just practice so that I can keep it all in one day, you know, seeing the patients and then follow up that you have to do when you see patients. I can do that in one day. And that's been good. When I used to see patients for a full day, then I had another half a day to get everything followed up and dealt with. But I said that it's absolutely critical to what I've been able to do and to understand about the patients. So yeah, but if you don't, I think that's, you know, Paul, that's where the whole, your community partnerships and your, you know, you got to have different minds coming together, I think, is the bottom line. The team is so invaluable to think from their unique perspective. And, you know, you can't make assumptions because, you know, the first time you do that, you're going to be off in the wrong field, you know, not even in the ballpark anymore.
And I think, Kate, you put it really nicely because, you know, and I was trying to make that kind of nuanced thing earlier too, like, you know, as a practitioner, you interact with your patients, you have that good, close understanding of their context and what they're going through and stuff. But I think a lot of times practitioners make that shift to, I understand the context, so I know what to do, rather than I understand the context. Now let's kind of work together to figure out what to do. And you know, and Bunny's walked that second road really well. And that's the, you know, and I think you need to learn that. I mean, you need to learn that over time.
But, you know, it's been an evolutionary process for myself too, because as I said, you know, early on, I wasn't thinking about the theory behind what I was doing or, you know, but that's just been, I can't even say how valuable that's been to really guide in terms of what this intervention should look like. You know, it's really been helpful.